This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, I'm Roger Kane. I'm Dean of the School of Advanced Study. I'm delighted to welcome you to this seminar in my series, and of course to apologise for the fact that we've been dislocated from our lunch. I do hope that you were able to get some sandwiches, and if you are still feeling a bit peckish at the end of the seminar, I'm sure they will still be left outside the courtroom, so do stop by on the way down to have some fruit. Normally we can sit around with the sandwiches on the table with the seminar in a very informal way. Anyway, here we are now, and I'm delighted to welcome Alessandro Scafi, who's a lecturer in the School of Advanced Study at the Warburg Institute. Alessandro is a much renowned author. His book, which is Mapping the Mind?
Mapping Paradise.
Mapping Paradise, that's it. Won the 2006 Association of American Publishers Award for Excellence, and it's been translated now into other languages. This afternoon he's going to be talking about something to do with a different part of the world. This is about India and the medieval geography of religion, mapping the religious mind. Now, Alessandro has got, I know, some stunning visuals, which was the reason for us to be relocated up here. We look forward immensely to seeing those, Alessandro, and to hearing your commentary. And I trust at the end you will be happy to answer any questions that we may have of you. So without more ado, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. On this, the 13th century Ebsdorf map, there is an image in the area here corresponding to India. The image of a man looking at the sun. The inscription tells you that all day, from morning to evening, the gymnosophists look at the burning sun. So they can find out something about the future, something about the mysteries of nature. But who are the gymnosophists? Gymnos is a late medieval Latin term which renders the Greek gymnos, naked. So gymnosophiste in medieval Latin, gymnosophistae in Greek, mean naked philosophers. But here, as you can see on the Ebsdorf map, the philosopher is not naked. And this afternoon I would like to explore how India was represented on medieval maps, how this representation of India fitted into the wider context of the medieval geography of religion. And my talk is divided into three parts. First, I will look in some detail at how India was represented in a major cartographical document of the Christian Middle Ages, which is the Ebsdorf map, but we'll also refer to other medieval maps. Second, I will make some remarks on this representation of India within the wide worldview that medieval maps display. Finally, I will comment on how this representation of India on maps was transformed in the later Middle Ages because of radical changes in cartography. So the first part, how was India represented on the Ebsdorf map? And why the Ebsdorf map? Because the Ebsdorf map, as many of you in this room know, is the largest, visually richest, most detailed of the non-medieval map in the world. The map, as also many of you know, has been however destroyed in the Second World War in 1944 during the bombing of Hanover, And now we have only 3 more facsimiles. But it was huge. It was nearly 13 square meters, some 1,200 entries. Historians of cartography have little doubt that the map was made in Elstoff, in the convent in Elstoff, which is in northern Germany. Because of this particular detail here, in Germany, you see here, Egbeckes Stock is written there, Elstoff, and with 3 small squares near the convent, marking the graves of martyrs buried there. So this is strong evidence of local knowledge. But the date is uncertain. 1230, 1300, scholars debate, and Armin Wolf has very recently put forward a compromise solution to be published in the next issue of Imago Mundi, and the editor is here, so you can confirm this anticipation. The compromise solution of Armin Wolf is that this Elstoff map was compiled around 1300, the later date, but on the basis of an earlier model. As most medieval mappemundi, the map has east at the top. But this particular map has a very special iconography. It's characterized by the way in which the whole earth is spanned by a gigantic figure of Christ. His head in the east, his feet in the west, his hands on either side, the north and the south. Where is India on this particular map? First of all, I should say that medieval geographers did not limit India to the subcontinent as we do today. This is one of the maps illustrating an analysis here. You know what it is. It's a manuscript from Lamberto Saint-Omer, Liber Floridus, compiled originally in the 12th century, but this manuscript is from the 15th century. East is at the top here, as in the other map, and this is the detail of Eastern Asia. So the large territory generally alluded to as India was sometimes subdivided into regions. And most commonly there were 3 sub-regions of India. India Inferior, Prima, Minor, east of Persia. India Superior, Secunda, Major, the subcontinent, Southeast Asia. India Tertia, or India Ultima, furthest east. So the name India was used in the Middle Ages to indicate a huge eastern region, the same way as we today refer to the Far East. You can see here on the Elstoff map the Caucasus Mountains. They run from Europe to the eastern limit of the world, as described by Orosius in the 5th century. And these are the northern limits of India. Here you see the Indus River springing from the Caucasus Mountains, and this inscription tells us that India is called so after the Indus River. For Orosius, Isidore of Seville, Honorius Augustodunensis, for later encyclopedists, the Indus River closed India in the west. It was the western frontier or the eastern end of the inhabited earth. India then stood for the ends of the earth, exactly as it is written here, India que finem facit. That is India which brings the terrestrial landmass to an end. The river Indus then indicates both India proper and what is beyond the ecumenate. The Indus River was the beginning of the end. North of the Caucasus Mountains, in the northeast extreme of the inhabited world, is Scythia. Scythia then to the north of India. So India, as Rabanus Maurus said in the 9th century, covered this immense area from the Indus in the west to the rising sun in the east, from the Caucasus Mountains in the north, and then beyond that lay Scythia, and then the ocean in the south. Within India, there were long rivers like the Ganges, the Indus, the Ephasis, the point at which Alexander the Great, isn't it, Claudia, had been forced by his soldiers to turn around and set out homewards. These were the boundaries of India. Now let us look at the territory within these boundaries. You can see the inscription beneath the head of Christ. This is the Latin text. And this text tells us that India was full of cities, full of people, so diverse appearances, diverse customs, all kinds of wild beasts, the eel, the manticora, the Indian bull, the unicorn, the parrot, green, reddish in color. India is rich also in precious stones, in gold, silver. In India there are 2 summers, 2 winters each year. The soil is so fertile that in some areas it allows 2 harvests a year. There are huge trees, fragrant, pigments. Here is the eel, as the text reports. The eel has the body of a horse, the tail of an elephant, the jaw of a goat. Its horns, a cubit long, are flexible, so they can be used simultaneously in attack and in defense. Here is the parrot. In India there are giant snakes swimming in the ocean, which can devour stags. This inscription, like many others, are no longer visible in the facsimile, but we know from the work of 19th century scholars that they were there. But anyway, you can see the giant snake. In India is found the island of Taprobana. Taprobana celebrated for its 10 cities. And Taprobana lies where the Indian Ocean begins. Every year has 2 summers, 2 winters. Twice a year Taprobana blooms with flowers, all in the text. One part of the island is inhabited by men, another is full of elephants, of monsters, dragons. The island is rich in gems, in precious stones. In India we find high mountains covered with gold, inaccessible because they are guarded by dragons and griffins. In the mountains of India we found the pygmies, people 2 cubits tall. They fight constantly with cranes. They give birth at the age of 3, and they're old at the age of 8. In India there are people who eat raw fish, drink from the salty sea, people hidden in mountain caves. Here we know from this text that the Fison, which is also called the Ganges, has 10 tributaries, and the Ganges took its name from the Indian king Gangare, who drowned in its waters. And we see the king here. There are huge water worms in that river. They can kill elephants with their claws and then drag the elephants into the water, as the inscription says. Near the source of the Ganges, we find people feeding on the smell of apples. But if they, as the inscription says here, if they inhale a strong or unpleasant odor, they can die. So as you can see, the X of Mat contains an articulated rhetoric of alterity. It celebrates the wonders of India. At the same time, India was perceived as something mysteriously familiar. The region had been subdued by the Greek god Bacchus. This is the city of Nysa, where Alexander the Great halted for 10 days on this march to India. According to Ptolemy, and Aristobulus, two historians that had accompanied Alexander on this march. They were then later quoted by many other classical writers such as Polybius, Strabo, Plutarch, Arrian. According to these witnesses, the Greek soldiers felt at home here in this mysterious city in India. Why? Because the inhabitants of Nyssa claimed that their city had been founded by the Greek god Bacchus, Dionysus, Dionysus. And Dionysus was born at Nyssa. And all the dances and the music that inhabitants performed in honor of Alexander the Great and his army, they were bacchanalians, cults of the Dionysian mysteries. I don't know if you see the inscription, the one on the above the name of Nyssa refers to India Inferior, meaning India Prima, the India east of the river Indus, and on the right is a tributary of the Ganges. But not only Alexander the Great, moreover, India had been Christianized by the Apostle Thomas. This is the shrine of Saint Thomas, as reported in the Acts of Thomas, Acta Tome, originally written in the 4th century in Syria, later translated into Greek and Latin. Thomas, one of the 12 apostles of Christ, reached India from Caesarea in Palestine, and then brought the gospel to India, preaching in India and eventually suffering martyrdom there. The author of the Acts of St. Thomas doesn't mention where Thomas was buried or where he suffered martyrdom. But of course, the later tradition had some particular views, held that St. Thomas' burial site was at Edessa in Syria, and Marco Polo claimed to have heard other things about that. Marco Polo claimed to have heard from Syrian Christians that Thomas' tomb was to be found on the eastern side from India. And the Ex of map, as you can see here, follows another tradition mentioned by Isidore in the Ortu et Obitu Patrum that locates Thomas' martyrdom and tomb in the city, as you can see, of Kalaminika, south of Madras. The map also features the miraculous lamp which burned day and night in front of Thomas' burial place. At the end of the 6th century, Gregory of Tours reported that a pilgrim named Theodorus, who had visited India, told him of this miraculous lamp placed just in this amazing church of striking dimensions, where the bones of Thomas the Apostle were kept. And no accident could extinguish the lamp, and the brightness of this lamp was ever lasting. In the Acts of St. Thomas, we also learned that Thomas made the king Gandafer in the city of Eleutherum, and you have the inscription here. He built overnight a marvelous palace for the king. So Bacchus, St. Thomas, made the marvel of India somehow familiar to the European readership, and of course the map reflects the popularity of the Alexander romance. Here, for example, we see the palace of King Porus, and it was after the victory of King Porus that Alexander started out a new dangerous journey to the most distant parts of India. Here are the people of Prasias, near the island of Taprobana, people, a good nation that offered hospitality to Alexander. Here you see the dog-headed people, the Cynocephali, met by Alexander the Great. And here we see Alexander himself on the front of the trees of the moon and the sun. The trees grew in a sanctuary in the stream east, at the very edge of the inhabited earth. You can see the altar of the sanctuary. Alexander was permitted to address the two oracles. And from there, he learned his fate. He was going to die next year in Babylon. And here are the gymnosophists, the naked philosophers, who converse with Alexander. We find the gymnosophists also on this other map, a 14th century map called the Higden map of the world. It is actually kept in the British Library. And in India, here, again, the gymnosophists, this is the inscription, that contemplate the sun all the time, and their eyes are not hurt by the sunbeams. Aristotle, Strabo, Philo, Alexandria, Plutarch all mention the gymnosophists as prudent, just, virtuous people. And the Christian respected the gymnosophists and the Indian philosophers in general. For example, in the 2nd century AD, Clement of Alexandria says that the Indian philosophers were virtuous, and the philosophy brings its fruit also among barbarians. And in the Alexander romances, this Plutarch account of Alexander's conversation with the Brahmins, with the wise men of India, reappears, and we find the story that Alexander spoke with, in particular, the oldest, the wisest of the Brahmins, Dandanis. In the 10th century Historia de Brevis, the history of the battles of Alexander, it's explained that the gymnosophists go about naked, they are wise, they live outside the cities, and they never fight anyone. The reason why on the Ebstock map they are not naked is a bit of an interesting challenge, probably because they were equated with Indian philosophers in general. Strabo had described the life of Indian philosophers or gymnosophists as frugal, saying that they dwelt in groves outside cities, so you can see the city here, and also the fact that the figure sits on a rock and looks at the sun. This is another inscription which is no longer visible on the facsimile, but we know it from 19th century map historian. In India there are Brahmins who live in such a mild climate that they cannot die. When they grow old and they want to die, they throw themselves into fire. So they seek another life. This is a late 8th century map, now in the Vatican Library. And we can see, this is my drawing, the India of the Brahmins, India Brahmanorum, different from India Manya, shown between the Ganges and the Indus. The India Brahmanorum borders Eden, Terra Eden, the Edenic region where paradise on earth, the garden of Adam and Eve, is found. And you see also the river Chrysochoras, a corruption from the Greek Chrysoroas, stream of gold. India is rich in gold. And this was something that Bede noted, that Pliny said about India, that was rich in gold. Then Bede read in the book of Genesis that the land of Adla was also rich in gold. So for him was a great hint that India was in the neighborhood of paradise. And so there were many texts talking about the Brahmins, widely read in the European Christian Middle Ages. For example, De Moribus Brahmanorum, attributed to Palladius, an Egyptian Greek of the 4th century, translated from Greek into Latin by Ambrose of Milan. Letters between Alexander and the Brahmin Dandanis, apocryphal letter of Alexander to Aristotle about India. So India was described as a land of opulence, as well as a country of wisdom. The representation of India on the Ebstock map, I think, has to be seen within the wider context of the map, within the worldview that the map displays. And I'm going to use another very important medieval map, the Hereford map, thought to have been drawn about 1300, to make my point. We find the description of India very similar to the one which is displayed on the Exodus map. Again, here we have East at the top, the three parts of the Earth, Asia, Europe and Africa. And you see that India is east of Persia. Here. India que finem facit, this is the inscription here. India brings, as we said, as we saw, is the end of the inhabited earth. India is defined as the end of the earth. This is this description similar to the one I've already shown you of India having as many peoples, many cities with diverse customs, all kinds of white peas, precious stones. But then, as you can see at the end, about all these monsters, the author says, and mountains, more may be read than depicted. So he was unable to show all the richness of India. This is the island of Taprobana, with the description of the mountains within it. These are the mountains of gold, guarded by dragons. Here we learn about the pygmies. This is a reference to the eel, native to India, according to Solinus. The Hereford map has also references to Bacchus. This is the city of Nisa, or Nua, by Dionysius. Father Liber for the Romans, inhabited a city with 50,000 people, is written. This is the sacred mountain where the Indians affirmed that Bacchus was reared. This is the people of Pandera, ruled by women. And this is the inscription about the parrots, the Indian parrots. Here we learn about humans living near the source of the Ganges who survive on the fragrance of apples. And that's also the other notion that if they smell an offensive odor, they can die. Here are the people of Thracias. We saw them, very powerful and also good Indian nation. And then the kingdoms of Porus, who fought against Alexander the Great. But let us appreciate, as I was saying, the wider picture, because the world map that were common in the medieval Christian Middle Ages in Western Europe between the 12th and the 15th or 14th centuries, I would say, showed us, many of you know, not only the geography but also history, and especially the interconnection between the two. I've been looking for medieval instructions how to compile a map, but so far I found, of course, Hugo Saint-Victor a very clear vision of how a map should display the work of God in human history through time and space at the same time. And this is very well displayed on the Hereford map. According to Hugh, God's plan to save mankind had unfolded and was still unfolding through time and space. So there was a spatially ordered sequence of events that followed a preordained model of transfer of excellence in culture and in political power. And this went from the furthest east, from the Garden of Eden, to the middle, to the Mediterranean basis. and the center of both history and geography, Jerusalem, was where the sacrifice of Christ redeemed mankind. So the march of history began in the earthly paradise and culminated in the center, in Jerusalem. And since then, the process of Christianization was spreading from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The church was expanding from the center to the margins to claim the whole earth. This is another well-known map. It's 11th century from a manuscript of the commentaries on the Apocalypse by Beatus of Yemana, who wrote the commentary in the 8th century. As you can see here, the expansion of the church is visualized by the indication of the burial places of the apostles. Their heads are indicating the places where they are buried, and this is of course an emphasis on the spread of the Christian church throughout the entire earth. As Beatus himself wrote in the commentary, the parochial Judaism had been replaced by the universal message of Christianity, which was meant for all peoples of the earth. This map shows how the voice of the apostles was reaching all the limits of the earth, and in particular, the burial place of Thomas in India was very important. The conversion of India was particularly important. India was the land lying at the extreme eastern part of the earth, and very near, as you can see here, the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden. So we already noted the importance of the Indus River as the boundary of India. Medieval geographers also defined the region immediately west of India, which is described in this text, which is common. Yes. As Parthia, or in the Bible is called Media. But what is important to me today is that it is from the Indus River that the march of history proceeds. So west of the Indus River we find reference to the 4 world empires. East of the Indus rivers is a mysterious region. You only reference to Alexander the Great, the Brahmins, but it's the region of the beginning of history. This is the Indus rivers. And as you can see, in the east is the Garden of Eden, near the head of Christ. So from the European perspective, India was distant in time, distant in space, near the beginning of history, far away on the edge of the earth. It was a land of extremes, where it was always summer, winter, people were tiny, were huge monsters, having strange habits. So it was a night world associated with Bacchus, dark, mysterious. It was the place where the Garden of Eden was, the place and the event marking the beginning of human history. And not far north of the Caucasus Mountains in Scythia, we find Gog and Magog, the very dangerous tribe enclosed by Alexander the Great. They feed on human flesh, they drink blood, and they are destined to storm the United States at the time of the Antichrist. This is a reference to the end, very near the beginning. The beginning, at the mouth of the Ganges, is the head of Christ, the Sol Justitiae, the Alpha and the Omega, Primus et Novissimus, the first and the last. And in fact, for the compilers of the map, the marvels they portrayed in India, they all referred to Christ. Like, for example, here, the ibex, or the ibex, I don't know how to say in English. The ibex is a wild mountain goat with large curving horns, and the horns are so strong that the ibex can use it also to land when it falls off a mountain. It doesn't get hurt. So the 2 horns, the legend says, they stand for the two testaments. For the two. Sorry. Yes. Thank you. Stand for the two testaments. And when you rely upon the Old and New Testament, you are protected, like the Ibex. So you can overcome the adversities with the help of the Old and New Testament. So the India, yes, enveloped the mystery of the beginnings, but it's also a reference to Christ. India bridges the then and the now, the beginning and the contemporary earth. It's a land of wise contemplatives. It's also a land of treasures. Splendor in virtues, splendor in material gems, fragrance of plants. And this comparison is actually was made by Rabanus Maurus. The inhabitants of India, for Rabanus, possess the gold of wisdom, the gems of all virtues. So this is interesting, that the Indian sages were respected by Christians. For example, Eusebius reports a story about an Indian sage going to the Agora, talking to Socrates, and asking Socrates, why are you pursuing your philosophical quest? What is the aim? And he said, I want to know about man, is centered about man. And then the Indian sage laughed. How could you understand man without considering all the divine hierarchies? So Eusebius praised this approach. Ambrose also didn't hide his admiration for the Indian philosophers. They were pagan, yes, in need of conversion, but were really virtuous. And of course, the story of Barlam and Josephat can be mentioned here. This is an image from a 15th century German manuscript, now at the Getty. It's very similar, if you know the story, to the story of Buddha. Barlam, this was retold in the early 13th century by the German poet Rudolf von Enz. Josephat was a son of a king of India who persecuted Christians, but then someone, an astrologer, had prophesied that Barlam was going to be converted to the Christian faith. So the father locked him in a tower. But then, as it happened to Buddha, Barlam managed to get out and came across, as you can see here, a beggar and a blind man. And then he realized that life is pain, is suffering, so he looked for another life, and then he was converted to Christianity. The father was very upset, but then also the father converted to Christianity. So this is a story that, to me, epitomizes the belief in the medieval Christianity that the future of India was to be wholly Christianized. Now, my last part, how was India representing the later map of the Middle Ages? You will appreciate the difference. Because on maps such as the Ebstorf and the Hereford map, the visual account of India was taken mainly from classical ancient sources, and this portrait was integrated into the Christian vision of universal history and geography. The whole of Asia was represented as a region of the past, defined by biblical, mythological law. It was a Christocentric, Eurocentric vision of history and geography. East of the river Indus, India was the mysterious region connected to the beginning, with the limits of the earth. West of the river Indus, we find the past events belonging to the transfer of dominion through the various world empires, Babylonian, Median, Persian, Greek, Macedonian, Roman. But later in the Middle Ages, the picture changed. We already are short of time, so I hope you forgive me if I cut a long story short, as you say in English. And this is very schematic. From about 1250 to 1350, new information about Asia and the Far East flooded Europe. Travelers such as John of Plano Carpini, William of Warburg, Odorico da Pordenone, Marco Polo, they all brought reports about the Far East. World maps were no longer compiled in the rural monastic scriptoria, but now in university cities, mercantile cities. Then we have the appearance of the nautical chart, completely introducing a different way of representing space. And they were also used for world maps. And then the rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography. And all these factors resulted in changes in cartographical practices. And the most important change is that the internet connection between time and space, between geography and history, was gradually lost in 14th and 15th century maps. And then Mapi Mundi were now reorientated. East was no longer at the top. You find other cardinal points at the top. So the historical geographical comprehensiveness was being reduced only to the geographical horizon. This is the map of Fra Mauro, another very well-known map. Fra Mauro was a Camaldolese map from the island of Murano, Venice. This is my drawing. You can see south is at the top. And this is India. In India, there is the text, this text where Fra Mauro notes that about India you can read ancient sources. They report amazing things about India, diversity of peoples, monsters, powerful lords, people eating human flesh, sorry, then human fish. If you can read the vernacular Venetian and molte altre cose che qui dir non posso, and many other things that I cannot mention here. Fra Mauro's map is actually famous for historians of cartography because he lacks human figures. It's full of text, and text in this vernacular very alive and addressing directly the reader. Not that, look, you wouldn't believe. This is, sorry, the text. Oh, I selected the most important part. Oops. This is where Fra Mauro reports of King Porus of Bactriana, the king, as you can write perhaps, I can read, subjugated by Alexander the Great. Then there is again the tradition about the Brahmins, Indian philosophers, astrologers, but he adds, Fra Mauro, these people are not very well known to us. If you want to know more about them, go to Arrian and Strabo. In fact, what is interesting about Fra Mauro's approach, he actually questions and challenges received knowledge. For example, this inscription, I didn't put my usual transcription because I hope it is readable for you. But anyway, he says that some write that in these Indias there are many types of human or animal monsters, but few people believe these things. I've made no note of them, Fra Mauro says, except for certain animals. They say that in India there are ants so large that they seem dogs. I will not dare to say that. Perhaps there could be a species of animals that are similar to ants. For example, the traditional account in the romance of Alexander says that Alexander the Great, after having defeated King Porus, attacked Gog and Magog and then closed these very dreadful tribes in a valley, and Marco Polo mentions Tenduk, a kingdom located on the borders of this valley. Fra Mauro is skeptic again. He doesn't think that the army of Alexander went as far as these regions. This is a legend near the Caspian Mountains. Fra Mauro did not believe that Gog and Magog were the wild tribes to be freed at the time of the Antichrist. As you can read that, I do not believe this opinion. This is a long inscription, but then basically says the Caspian area has been visited by many people, by Venetian merchants. We know of other peoples living there. Nobody has found an apocalyptic tribe. We know that in distant Eastern Asia there are two peoples actually, of Ung and Mongol. They could be perhaps they are Gog and Magog. But the biblical reference to Gog and Magog had to be understood allegorically. People had to read properly the Bible. So what is striking about Framaro's map today is that he updated the cartographical law with contemporary human geography. For example, Framaro describes all the islands surrounding the Sea of India, refers to the experiences of sailors, of pearl fishers there, reports about the trade between India and Qatar. So it doesn't represent India as a mysterious region belonging to the past. India is a geographical contemporary place. And also you can imagine that this sense of the universal spread of Christianity was being gradually lost. And not by chance, Framaro refers to the diversity of languages, but also to the diversity of faiths. For example, here in the island of Colombo, Framaro says that people are of various faiths: Jews, Muslims, idolaters, and the other islands are indicated as inhabited by Christians. It's a multicultural vision of Asia. For example, in India Secunda, in Southeast Asia, there are a large number of pagan hermits. And in the Framaro map, you don't find any reference to the tomb of St. Thomas. And this leads me to this other map by Andreas Walsperger from southern Germany, 1448. This is my drawing. And this is the detail of Eastern Asia. Again, here south is at the top, as you can notice. And Walsperger map retains, authority is quite slow to evolve, but retains some features of the encyclopedic maps of the earlier times. For example, we find legends about the pygmies, we found the trees of the sun and the moon, the mountains of gold, and we see a cannibal eating human flesh here. Also the Garden of Eden and Gog and Magog are indicated. But also here, like in Framaro map, we have lost the vision, the comprehensive vision of geography and history culminating in Christ, the ultimate revelation fit for every culture. Here, I've chosen this map because it's very interesting in the way in which he acknowledges the existence of other faiths. As he says in actually text, Walsperger color-coded his place signs. He used red for Christian cities and black for non-Christian cities. As you can see, Eastern Asia is mostly populated by non-Christians. So Christianity today also is perceived as one of the faiths, a denomination, a specific religious tradition coexisting with other religious traditions, such as Islam, Judaism, Hinduism. But then, in the Middle Ages, at the time of the Extov map, Christianity was perceived by Christians as the ultimate revelation to all mankind. A religion including all forms of cultures: Romans, Indians, Greeks, Jews. This is Bethlehem on the Extov map, the place of the Nativity of the Lord. As this text says, the ox and the ass attended the birth of Christ. And here you see the stars, and Scripture saying that the star appeared to the shepherds a few miles away. This is the star. But the star, as you know, appeared to the Magi. And actually the story of the Magi, I think, indicates very clearly this idea that the whole culture of the world had to be englobed in the Christian ending of history. And not by chance. I think it's interesting, the Magi were sometimes understood as Brahmins, as at the end of the 14th century, in his itinerarius, Johannes Witte de Hese observed. He thought that the Magi once lived in India. So, for example, I could mention many Christian medieval historians, such as Isidore and Seville, seeing that the old tracks of human history, the Persians, the Greeks, the Jews, they were culturally conditioned, but then the ultimate revelation came from Christ, God himself incarnate. As you can see, there are many suns, including in this part of the map, the oracle of the sun, telling Alessandro the Great his future, the sun of the gymnosophists, but Christ, at the middle, is the rising sun, the real sun, the light of the world, radiating light from the east. So a Christocentric picture of the world that includes a depiction of Hindu sages, the gymnosophists, gazing at the burning sun, as the inscription says, all day, to find something about the future. Like the righteous Israelites of the Old Testament, they are wise, virtuous people, not just eremiti pagani, as later Fra Mauro will term them. They are waiting for the final revelation. They look at the burning sun, but the real sun, Christ, is very near. They try to find out something of their future, but their future is the conversion to the Christian faith. Thank you.
Alessandro, thank you very much, and not just for the richness of your narrative, but for the compelling mastery of the technology that you displayed, and those stunning images and their accompanying transcriptions of the inscriptions was extraordinarily helpful. I'm sure you've raised a lot of questions in people's minds. Who would like to start us off? Please.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when watching the sun and so on, were they comparing Jesus Christ to the sun, or the light of the sun?
Yes, yes.
In what way?
Well, because it was it was the sun of salvation, raising and dispelling the darkness of night. This was a commonplace in medieval Christian literature, and the interesting aspect is this particular iconography on this map, where actually the head of Christ coincides with the rising sun. But this map, as map historians know in this room, has been differently interpreted. I have my own theory about the presence of Christ, but Christ, I've read, could be interpreted as embracing the earth, also being sacrificed for the earth, or being identified with the earth. I think there is a reference to Adam as the first man, because of the cardinal points that is announced. So yes, indeed, the sun was assimilated to Christ.
Yes, I was thinking about sun worship in the olden times and pagan times. Were they sort of taking that over on the feet?
Well, this is an old, big issue, if I can use this expression, yes, but the story of how Christianity, you may say, adopted or manipulated or transfigured, depending on your viewpoint, earlier traditions is quite a rich area to be explored. Yes.
Peter,
you talked very interestingly about the changes in the maps that you saw. I mean, it's probably a naive question, but does that reflect a difference in the purpose of map making? One begins by wondering sort of what were these nuns doing making this world map, and how is that different from the reason for making a world map maybe 150 years later? Or?
I think so. Also, I have to be short, but as I hinted at, the context of my name changed in that century. And I think the emergence of the nautical chart is quite important, because nautical charts introduced the notions that were happily ignored before, notion of distance, orientation. So what didn't really matter earlier distance, exact location, increasingly mattered later. So you can already see that the purpose of earlier maps was to give a comprehensive vision of human history, as it were from God's viewpoint, because the map reader could see the development of history from beginning to the end, also something to happen, like the final coming of Christ. While these later maps, introducing the concern about distance and what was actually there in contemporary Earth, changed the purpose and the context in particular. So really I cut a very long story short that I would also like to explore more, because what I found when I studied those maps is how intriguing is that this cartographical change coincided with important theological shifts. Again, the usual question, what came first? Do they correspond to each other? Thank you.
Two comments and a question, if I may. Well, in fact, three comments, because I don't know about anybody else. I will sit here for the whole day looking at these pictures and having them expounded. And we can never see these things. Anyway, my comment, just to go back to this question of the sun and the rising. I mean, it's also, isn't it, you mentioned Adam, but it's also inbuilt into the Old Testament. I only know Ezekiel, but the insistence there on the east as the source of light is quite striking, and you do find the privileging of the East in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, all the way through. So that again may be something that's older coming through and perhaps related to Adam, you would say. My question was quite a small one, was is there an order in which the apostles die and get buried? And I wondered if Thomas was the last, and that was why, as it were, he was put next to Eden. In other words, the apostles Christianized the world. I'm thinking of the Beatus man. They gradually die off in bits of the world and get buried. And then Thomas the last is the closest to Eden. Is there any significance in that, or is this my...
I haven't thought that. This is a good point to explore, because no, because there is Thomas was there because there was a belief, a tradition that he went to India. So it's interesting to see, but I think it wouldn't have a great impact on the representation of the burial places, the exact date when the apostles died, because they may be considered contemporary. But I haven't thought of this.
Yeah, actually, just reacting to what Madam was saying. What is the reason that, by which you're saying that Thomas was the last one in the series of the apostles to die?
I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. I was asking, is there an order?
No, well, actually, as far as I know, I don't remember now at this moment what is the traditional date for the martyrdom, but I remember quite well the one for the landing of Thomas in the tradition. It is 52 AD. That's what is usually... even though I should say I'm not clearly aware at this moment who said when, etc. But basically, this is the typical year which is given. So basically, I wouldn't...
we will go through the other 11 first.
So I mean, considering the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, which is later, you know, and this kind of chronology, I wouldn't think that that is the issue. Actually, I wanted to raise a different question, which was seeing the passage from the late medieval to, let's say, from the medieval to the late medieval, really, maps, particularly from Mauro, I was somehow struck by the fact that, as you mentioned, Thomas is no more present in the map. And this is somehow a matter of somehow doubt and perplexity, because in a certain way, the location of Thomas' burial in India had become clearer and more substantiated and precise in the late Middle Ages. Let's think particularly of Marco Polo, who clearly specifies that the tomb is in Calamina, and that also another element is the widespread presence of Nestorians throughout Asia. So I'm just wondering how basically did this sort of travel accounts, ethnographic or pre-ethnographic accounts on Asia, so to say, percolated within cartography. It seems that the connection was far from being straightforward. There was I would have expected that these turrets basically signaled everywhere in the east, whereas we don't find it.
Thank you. Before answering, I should actually notice that Paolo Aragna is actually working on the continuation of the story. So if you want to know about India and the perception of India in early modern age, Paolo is the guy to ask. It's a very interesting question. I think it has to do with, as was referring to earlier, to the weakening of the vision of the spread of the world up to the limits of the earth. So Fra Mauro as a cartographer was not any longer interested in showing the spread of Christianity. He wouldn't perceive, as I tried to show, the sage Indian philosophers are righteous philosophers waiting for Christ. They were idolaters there. So the importance of St. Thomas' burial was not so much his priority, even though, as you were saying, the location of his tomb was more certain than earlier. But I think this has to do with the concerns of Fra Mauro as a cartographer, interested mainly in contemporary human geography, reporting about trades, about what is there. For example, I started with it on the Fra Mauro map. In order to not to be too long, I cut out the slide. It represents beautiful sanctuary in India, but it doesn't come to his mind that they could say this is Thomas. It's just a sanctuary described by Marco Polo as beautiful, but there is no, what is interesting, what is there now, showing this other land compared to any other land. Persia, for example, in Aristotle map is the place of the world empire, and then Cyrus is important for the Old Testament. Nothing there. Persia is a place of trade where horses are bred, exchanged with Europe, with the north, with the east. So I think it has to do with this one.
I was especially interested in the interaction between text traditions, cartography and iconography, which you illustrated very well in the reference to the Alexander Romans. I was just curious the eschatological aspect of it, because Alexander Romans, the world map was reflected in a hugely popular medieval text, the relation of Pseudo-Methodius, which has Enoch and Elijah, the Caspian Gates, the Gog and Magog, everything. Has anyone worked whether there have been quotes from this widely circulated text, the relation of Pseudo-Methodius on these maps, particularly the eschatological aspects, Enoch and Elijah, Gog and Magog, etc.
Yes, on earlier maps we find this.
On earlier
maps. For example, this map I showed Lamberto Saint-Omer, even though the manuscript is a bit later, but you and the 12th century work, on the island of Paradise you find the inscription and Enoch and Elijah. It's very interesting how Fra Mauro deals with this problem in a very characteristic way. He's not interested in displaying this on the map. We discussed in some lectures, but it's not. He represents Paradise, which is another story, as separated from the world of the geographers. So this, I think I would say yes, but this is part of the part 1 and 2, the medieval, the Mappa Mundi tradition, going up to the latest 14th century.
The second question?
Very briefly, yes, there was one more.
Yes. Maybe also to the 15th, 16th century development of the tradition. When do the areas between India and China begin to appear in these maps? Presumably in this period, because they're mentioned in text traditions, Bactria, for example.
Yeah.
Do they appear in the late 15th, 16th century, the earliest occurrence?
But the division of Parthia and the reference to Bactria, they are already there in Stoffman, because they are taken from ancient sources. This is quite clear. But it's interesting actually to check the pace by which map makers follow the Charles' accounts and the progress in the knowledge of the earth. Because what happened in the 13th century with these trips of missionaries, explorers in the Far East, coming back to Europe, reporting very detailed in a very detailed way about the East, had an impact in 15th century maps. And you see then from Mauro such a precise, in the so-called Genoese map, for example, reports about the Qatari and or the Bolgia map. It's very detailed about Qatari as distinct from India.
Please.
We have two questions.
Yeah, of course.
Short ones. One is that the representation of Christ in the map was really, really interesting. But when you showed the other map, the Hereford, it was very similar to a design of a church, because the second coming of Christ was in a kind of tympan at the upper part of the map. And I'm just wondering if it could be compared to the representation, the symbolic interpretation of the church, which was interpreted as the body of Christ. And if the map actually seems to be the body of Christ, it could perhaps be compared to the church as a body of Christ, especially the design of the map, which is very similar to the gate of a big cathedral. And at the top of the gate there is always the Last Judgment, the second coming of Christ, which is represented. And perhaps it could...
See, as Catherine and Roger perhaps already know, the Hereford map has inspired different interpretations. And among these interpretations, since it was definitely, we know it was in Hereford Cathedral, and map historians have tried to locate where exactly is the cathedral. And I think we can safely say that it was actually object of prayer, no? Whether in the main altar or in the side chapel, depending on the different opinions. Also, I've heard an idea, a bit perhaps eccentric, when there was a Hereford map conference in 1999, I met someone who was really convinced that this map was designed for helping the liturgy of consecration of priests. And then he said, because if you lie down on the floor and you look up at the map from that perspective, you can see actually a crucified Christ drawn by the islands of the Mediterranean. I tried actually.
Can I just use that question? Because we need to draw to a close in a minute, so please.
The next one.
No, it's just in front of you if you would, please.
I just want to ask really quickly. I was just wondering, is there any evidence in any of the maps from the early period or later period of a Christianisation of legends from India? So that a lot of the things that you say are accounts or just sayings or whatever, legends from early texts, but from sort of Christian sources. Is there any evidence of them taking of Hindu legends or legends from there, and they turned it into a sort of more Christianised way? Because, for example, from what I know, is like the Ganges is because of the goddess Ganga. The Indus is from Indradev, which is also the father of Suryadev, the sun, and stuff like that. So these are different legends which are part of that culture, but have a sort of slightly different viewpoint. Is there any evidence?
Thank you. That's something that should be. I don't know much of it, so this is my honest answer. But I think that it's very interesting to see that this notion percolated into the sources. What I've come across are mainly classical sources used by medieval makers, and this story of Barlam and Joseph comes to my mind because this clearly is influenced by Eastern sources. But I can't now tell you precisely. I wonder about whether actually any scholar can answer you to identify the precise stages of the transmission.
So, just on Barlam Joseph, there is a wide philological tradition in the 19th century and early 20th century. So basically, this is a certain. It is a transmission.
I don't know how, from which authors, but definitely it has an Eastern origin. Yes, and this is interesting.
And very last comment.
Okay, well, I'm just dovetailing on that. There's also the notion that sacred geography, in terms of map making, is also the body of God. So if you see how temples are arranged in pilgrimage centers, in medieval India, it'll be mapped according to the body of Vishnu. So that's making me think of your eclectic friend who was looking at the ceiling and seeing the body of Christ. So I'm just adding on to that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alessandro, we'd like to thank you again for your presentation, and now to add to that, our thanks for responding to the rich vein of questions that your presentation stimulated. It's been a wonderful Dean seminar, and perhaps if I might say to everyone who is here, if you are interested in the history of maps and mapping and want to follow that further, there is a series of regular series of seminars, of which Alessandro Scafi is one of the co-conveners, that occurs in the Warburg Institute on late afternoons on Thursdays, about 3 times a year, and I'm sure are advertised on the Warburg website, dealing with the history of maps through from the very earliest of times to times much closer to the present. But for now, thank you again, Alessandro. I'm sure we'll have to